You're sitting inside a dark limestone cave right now. It's 100,000 years ago. The fire is slowly dying down to embers. There's just the biting cold of the glacial air, the howling wind outside the entrance, and the body of someone you knew lying completely still on the dirt floor. Just yesterday, they were hunting with you. They were sharing meat. They were laughing by the fire. Now, the warmth is completely gone. The chest isn't moving. And right now, you have to make a choice. Leaving the body inside the cave means the smell will soon attract alpha predators. Carrying it outside means exposing your family to hyenas in the dark. But simply discarding it like a piece of spoiled meat feels profoundly, deeply wrong. Your chest hurts looking at them. And somewhere, at some point, an ancestor looked down at a lifeless companion, picked up a sharp stone, and did something completely unprecedented. They began to dig.
Here's the thing. From a purely evolutionary perspective, a dead body is useless. It cannot hunt, it cannot defend the group, it cannot pass on genes. In fact, it is an active liability. It attracts apex predators, it carries disease. The most practical, logical move for a nomadic band of early humans would be to drop the body and keep moving. And yet, we don't do that. We have never done that. Every human culture across time has developed intricate, exhausting, and dangerous rituals just to deal with the physical remains of the people we lose. So when did we start caring? Why did our ancestors begin treating a lifeless shell with reverence? And what does the way we handle our dead tell us about the exact moment we truly became human? This is the story of how we learned to remember, and it was never just about hiding a body.
Before we look at ancient human graves, we need to talk about elephants. Specifically, what happens when an elephant encounters a skeleton in the middle of the African savanna. In the early 2000s, biologists began studying how wild elephant herds interact with the remains of their own kind. What they discovered was startling. If an elephant comes across the bones of another elephant, it stops. The entire herd slows down. They walk up to the skeleton in complete silence. They don't just sniff it and walk away. They use their trunks to gently touch the skull. They turn the jawbone over. They run their sensitive feet over the ivory tusks. They don't do this with the bones of rhinos or buffaloes or lions. They do it exclusively with elephants. Even if the individual died years ago, and even if the herd didn't know them in life, the remains receive a quiet, solemn inspection. By every behavioral metric available, the animals are recognizing something profound in those dry bones. They are registering a loss.
Elephants are not the only ones. In 2010, researchers filmed a chimpanzee mother at a wildlife sanctuary. Her 9-month-old infant had died from a severe infection. For several days, she refused to let the body go. She carried the tiny corpse everywhere, gently grooming its fur, swatting away flies, and checking its face for signs of life. When she finally accepted that it wasn't waking up, she laid it carefully on a clearing in the grass, stepped back, and watched it from a distance for hours. This changes the entire frame of our investigation. If you assume that grief, or an awareness of death, is a unique product of human culture, you are mistaken. The emotional raw material was already there. It was installed in mammalian neurology long before our specific branch of the evolutionary tree split off. Evolution did not create the concept of mourning out of nothing when Homo sapiens arrived. It repurposed an ancient system of deep social bonding.
When you form an alliance that lasts for decades, your brain becomes hardwired to expect that individual to be there. When they suddenly vanish, the system glitches. The bond doesn't just snap like a rubber band. It pulls, it aches. Which means the real mystery is not why humans feel sad when someone dies. The mystery is what happened when early humans took that raw mammalian grief and turned it into physical architecture. It's the moment we stopped just standing over a body and started changing the landscape to keep it safe. To find the earliest evidence of this transition, we have to travel to South Africa, deep inside a cave system called Rising Star. And we have to look at a creature that wasn't even fully human. In 2013, recreational cavers squeezed through a terrifyingly narrow vertical slot called the chute. It was an opening just 7.5 inches wide.
It led into a pitch-black chamber located nearly 100 feet underground. Inside that isolated chamber, the floor was covered in bones.
They belong to a newly discovered hominin species named Homo naledi. These creatures lived roughly 250,000 to 300,000 years ago. They were evolutionary cousins of ours, but they looked very different. They had brains about the size of an orange. They had curved fingers built for climbing trees. They stood only about 5 feet tall. But here is the detail that baffled scientists. There were no marks of carnivore teeth on the bones. There were no signs that water currents had washed the bodies into the cave. There were no tools, no ancient campfires, and no signs that anyone had ever lived inside that pitch-black, suffocating chamber. The individuals ranged from newborn babies to elderly adults. The researchers who led the excavation proposed an explanation that shocked the scientific community. They argued that Homo naledi was deliberately carrying their dead into the deepest, darkest recesses of the earth.
Think about what that would mean. To get a body into that chamber, a creature with a brain a third the size of ours had to navigate a labyrinth of jagged rock in total darkness. They would have needed torches or firebrands. They would have had to drag a heavy, lifeless companion through a gap barely wide enough for a modern slender cavern. And they did it repeatedly, over generations. The scientific community erupted in fierce debate. Many experts argued that a small-brained hominin couldn't possibly possess the symbolic capacity required for ritual burial. They suggested alternative explanations. Maybe a catastrophic event trapped them all at once. Maybe they fell through a hidden opening that later sealed up. But if the intentional deposition hypothesis is correct, it shatters our timeline of human uniqueness. It implies that managing the dead with deliberate effort is not a luxury born of high intelligence. It is an ancient, primal urge that predates the evolution of our massive brains. It means that before we were smart enough to invent agriculture or writing or metal tools, we were already willing to risk our lives in the dark just to put our dead somewhere safe.
As we move forward in time to our closest relatives, the Neanderthals, the evidence becomes much clearer, and it reveals a shifting dynamic between biological danger and psychological necessity. For a long time, popular culture portrayed Neanderthals as brutal, unfeeling cavemen, but archaeology has completely rewritten that narrative. Consider Shanidar Cave, located in the Zagros Mountains of northern Iraq. In the 1950s, an archaeologist named Rolf Selecki discovered the remains of 9 Neanderthals who lived around 60,000 years ago. One skeleton, known as Shanidar 4, was found buried in a fetal position. When scientists analyzed the soil samples surrounding the bones, they found something unexpected: high concentrations of pollen from ancient wildflowers. Selecki concluded that this Neanderthal hadn't just been dumped in a hole. He had been laid to rest on a bed of bright, colorful wildflowers. The flower burial became a global sensation, offering proof that Neanderthals possessed a poetic, gentle spirit. They loved, they mourned, they said goodbye with floral tributes.
Decades later, other scientists re-examined the site with more advanced technology. They offered a more grounded alternative. The pollen, they argued, might have been brought into the cave by burrowing desert rodents. The flowers weren't a tribute. They were just background noise from prehistoric pests. But even without the flowers, Shanidar Cave tells an incredible story. Another skeleton at the site, Shanidar 1, belonged to an individual who had suffered catastrophic injuries during his life. He had a massive blow to the side of his head that likely blinded him in one eye. His right arm was fractured in multiple places and had eventually amputated at the elbow. He walked with a severe limp. Yet, his bones showed that he survived these injuries for decades. He couldn't hunt, he couldn't run. The only way he survived was because his group chose to feed him, protect him, and when he finally died, they didn't abandon him. They dug a grave inside the very cave where they lived.
This brings us to a crucial realization about early burials. A decomposing body is a severe biological hazard. It releases toxic gases, it harbors dangerous bacteria. Most importantly, the smell of decaying flesh acts as a beacon for apex predators, like cave hyenas and saber-toothed cats. If safety was the only goal, the logical response would be to carry the dead body as far away from the living camp as possible. But the Neanderthals at Shanidar didn't do that. They kept their dead close. They buried them right under the floorboards of their home. They chose to accept the hard work of digging a grave through rocky soil inside their shelter. They balanced the physical threat of predators with a psychological need that they couldn't ignore. They refused to let the people who defined their social world simply disappear into the wilderness.
But here is where things get truly strange, and where our neat, comforting narrative about ancient funerals begins to fragment. For a long time, historians assumed that once humans learned to dig holes, the evolution of handling the dead was a straight, linear path toward the modern cemetery. We assumed that burial was the natural, universal goal. It turns out, we were looking at the past through the narrow lens of our own modern traditions. When you look at the wider archaeological record of early Homo sapiens, you don't just find bodies laid flat in quiet earth. You find an absolute explosion of bizarre, complex, and intensely visceral interactions with the decomposing remains of loved ones. Consider what archaeologists found in places like the Natufian culture sites in the Levant, dating back roughly 12,000 to 15,000 years ago. These people were living at the critical boundary line between nomadic hunting and permanent farming. When they buried their dead, they didn't just walk away and let the earth do its work.
Years after the initial burial, once the flesh had completely decayed, they would go back. They would deliberately reopen the graves. They would reach down into the dark soil, detach the skulls from the skeletons, and pull them back up into the light of day. They didn't do this out of disrespect. They took these clean, dry skulls, covered them in colored plaster, modeled artificial facial features onto the bone, and placed shells into the empty eye sockets to mimic the look of the living. Then, they brought these modified skulls back into their homes, displaying them on shelves, keeping them present in the daily life of the family. In other Upper Paleolithic sites across Europe, researchers have uncovered bones that show clear signs of what is called excarnation, the practice of deliberately removing the flesh from a body shortly after death using stone tools. In caves like Gough's Cave in England, dating to 14,700 years ago, Homo sapiens systematically defleshed human remains, carefully cleaning the long bones and even shaping the cranial vaults into functional drinking cups.
For a long time, scientists looked at this evidence and immediately labeled it as brutal, warlike cannibalism, but closer inspection revealed no signs of violence on the bones. This introduces a completely different psychological reality. To our modern sensibilities, touching a decomposing corpse or drinking from a relative's skull sounds like the ultimate act of horror. But to our ancestors, the real horror was absolute erasure. The physical body was a precious resource of memory, a physical anchor to the person who was gone. By manipulating the bones, by separating the clean, enduring skeletal frame from the messy, volatile flesh, they were actively managing the transition from a living human to an ancestor. They were separating the part of the person that rots from the part of the person that stays forever. It tells us that ancient humans didn't look at a dead body as an object to be quickly hidden or gotten rid of. They looked at it as a transformative entity. Death wasn't an instantaneous switch that flipped from person to nothing. It was a slow, agonizing process that required active human intervention, a collaborative effort between the living and the dead to navigate the terrifying landscape of loss.
This brings us to the ultimate cognitive leap. It is the moment where handling the dead stopped being a reaction to grief and biological danger and became an active investment in a world no one had ever seen. To see what this looks like when it completely matures, we have to look at the remarkable site of Sungir, located just a few hours east of Moscow, Russia. Roughly 34,000 years ago, a group of Upper Paleolithic hunters buried their dead in the frozen permafrost. Among the graves discovered there, one stands out above almost anything else in the prehistoric world. It is a double burial containing two young children, a boy around 12 years old and a girl around 9. They were laid out straight, head to head, in a single grave. But it wasn't the orientation of their bodies that left archaeologists stunned. It was what was buried with them.
The children were covered from head to toe in thousands of meticulously carved beads made from mammoth ivory. Scientists estimate that each individual bead took at least an hour to manufacture. Between the two children, there were over 10,000 beads. That represents an unimaginable investment of labor. It means an entire band of hunters spent months
perhaps years, doing nothing but carving ivory beads, just to sew them onto tailored leather clothing that would immediately be buried underground, never to be seen by the living again. But it didn't stop there. The children were equipped with ivory lances carved from straightened mammoth tusks, a technology that required boiling the ivory for hours just to bend it straight. They wore bracelets of solid ivory, rings on their fingers, and were accompanied by a massive collection of art pieces, fox teeth pendants, and heavy layers of red ochre, a natural clay pigment that stained the soil a vibrant blood-red color. Think about the sheer economic sacrifice of that moment, in a harsh Ice Age environment where survival hung by a thread every single day. This group chose to bury a fortune of resources with 2 children who could no longer contribute to the hunt. Why? Why would a rational, survival-driven group of primates throw away thousands of hours of life-saving labor on a pair of corpses? The answer is that by 34,000 years ago, humans had invented something completely unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. They had invented the future tense. They had developed what cognitive scientists call mental time travel, the unique ability to imagine scenarios completely detached from the present reality.
When you look at the Sungir burials, you are not looking at people simply reacting to a tragedy. You are looking at a group that is actively equipping these children for a journey. They were dressing them for a specific destination. By painting the bodies in red ochre, the color of living blood, and arming them with spears, they were making a profound symbolic statement. This person is not gone. They are somewhere else, and they will need their identity, their status, and their tools when they arrive. This is the exact moment where human culture separates itself completely from the rest of the animal kingdom. An elephant feels grief, a chimpanzee understands absence, but only a human can look at a cold, motionless child and see a traveler entering an invisible realm. The grave became our very first canvas for abstract thought. Before we wrote down our history, before we built cities, we used the soil as a ledger to write down our theories about the universe.
We treat modern funerals like they are separate from the cold, hard realities of biology and survival. But when you look back across hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution, you realize that handling the dead is one of the most fundamental, load-bearing behaviors that holds our entire species together. The research across anthropology, neurology, and evolutionary biology is remarkably consistent. The immense effort our ancestors poured into graves, whether it was dragging bodies through 7-inch gaps in pitch-black caves, burying loved ones right beneath their living room floors, or spending thousands of hours carving ivory beads, wasn't a waste of energy. It was the glue that allowed large, complex human societies to exist in the first place. Because to cooperate with other humans at scale, you need an extraordinary amount of trust. You need to know that you are part of a group that values you, that remembers you, and that will protect your memory when you can no longer protect yourself. By taking care of the dead, early humans were constantly sending a powerful, unshakable signal to the living. You matter. Your story doesn't end when your breath stops. We will not abandon you to the wolves. The part that nobody has fully solved, and this is something genuinely worth sitting with, is why that instinct remains completely unbreakable today. We live in a highly scientific world. We know exactly what happens to a body biologically when it dies. We understand the cellular decay, the chemical transformations, the absolute finality of brain death. We don't need to fear that cave hyenas will smell a body and attack our apartment buildings. And yet, if someone suggested throwing a deceased loved one into a landfill, our entire nervous system would instantly recoil in deep, visceral horror. The science tells us the body is just matter, but our evolutionary wiring tells us it is sacred. Even the most hardened cynic feels a quiet shift in energy when walking through an ancient cemetery.
We built a world of concrete, satellites, and digital networks. And underneath all of that massive modern infrastructure, a mammalian instinct that was born in the dark limestone caves of the Ice Age is still running quietly in our subconscious minds, which brings you right back to that cold cave entrance 100,000 years ago. An ancestor finished digging a hole in the rocky earth. They laid a companion down, covered them with dirt, and placed a heavy stone on top to keep the wilderness out. They didn't do it because they had a grand theological theory.
They did it because they looked at someone they loved and realized that even though the breath had stopped, the relationship hadn't. They had seen the same sun, shared the same meat, and survived the same winters, and they refused to let that connection disappear into the dark. We still don't fully understand why our brains are wired to hold on to things that are gone. We just know that we can't let go.